Hello, 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 and welcome to the Blue Oval Podcast. My name is Ben Weissel, and joining me, as always, Garrett Allen. How's it going, man?
Ben, we have been working on these summer rankings, these cross country summer rankings since what, June? We've probably been
Yeah,
working on them since June.
thinking about
And
him since May and maybe
I
even April, honestly.
was gonna say March, you know, uh, we've been thinking about cross country for a while. We've been basking in this numerous months long of writing content for cross country, which we love. And now we're only like 2 weeks out from less than 2 weeks out from the season ending. Um, I I feel I feel pretty sad. I feel like a little early sadness for the season about to end. I'm also getting excited for what I think is my most favorite time of the year, which is Quals calculation. So I don't know if you feel the same way. I don't know if you're excited for track, but I'm like miss cross a little bit.
Cross country is so nice to cover because there's only one race on the men's side, one race on the women's side, and you don't have to while it is fun to see each event during track, there is something to the simplicity of cross country where everybody's all together in one race. The team component is such a bigger factor than it is, at least for us, when we're covering just the distance side of things in cross country. So yeah, it's always bittersweet when we get to this point where all the hard work we know is about to be completed, but then we got to move on and move on from cross country, which I think has a special place in both of our hearts.
Well, speaking of hard work, appreciate the few people who did leave ratings and reviews, put in the work over there. We got one on Apple, we got two on Spotify. Good, we appreciate that. Get those numbers up, continue to do so. Thank you to everyone who has. We appreciate it. If you're on Apple, go to the show website or go to the show page on your app. Don't go to the episode page. Go to the show page on your app, scroll to the bottom. You'll see the ratings and reviews section. You can add a comment saying that we're just, super dandy there. You can leave 5 stars, or you can go on Spotify as well. You can also leave 5 stars there. I know you don't think it helps. It does. But please, thank you, thank you, thank you. Ben, Quals projections, regional meet preview. That is what we're going to be doing today. And before we begin, I want to give people just a quick highlight understanding of what we're doing today, how we're doing it, and then a few key, aspects just to, make quick notes on. So what we're doing today is we are going to be talking about the regional championships for D1. There's 9 different regions, and we're also going to be playing around with projections in terms of who qualifies for the national meet. The national meet is a very, very, very difficult meet to qualify for just via, well, I should just say via the math behind it. There's a lot of technicalities that make it very difficult. Luckily, we've worked with Bo Waggoner, who runs a website called xcquals.com, as well as a few others, to collect and refine results that he then feeds into a system and then outputs what the national qualifiers are going to be. We have been using that system for the past few years. It has worked great. He's been great to work with. We appreciate it. We are now recording this on Monday, November 6th. There are still a few small tweaks that need to happen with his calculator, and those small tweaks are as follows. The Wisconsin men, we believe, might have run a B team at the Nutty Comb Invitational. A B team is basically when you have when you're missing 4 of your top 7 from the regional lineup. It doesn't count towards any team beating you for qualification purposes. So we believe that they might have run a B team at the Nutty Comb Invitational. If that's the case, then things might look a little different. We are assuming, for the purposes of our calculations, that Wisconsin men did in fact run an A lineup at the Nutty Comb Invite. So we're assuming that. It could change. We're working on that, just letting you know. On the women's side, Boston College women are not listed as a B team in the Beantown results. They should be. The Wisconsin women are not listed as a B team in the Badger Classic results. They should be. Luckily, any team that beat those teams at those respective meets probably aren't going to be really in the conversation that we're going to be talking about. Luckily, it seems like it's going to be pretty down pat to a handful of certain teams. The only team that could potentially play a tricky role with is if you think Harvard women are not going to be a top 2 team in their region. So just something to consider there. But otherwise, I think you can just assume that everything else is pretty spot on. Anything I just mentioned shouldn't really impact anything. And so, yeah, just want to let everyone know about that. Did I cover everything?
Yeah, I think we're good. And Colas points, remember, are just how many times you have beaten an automatic qualifying team, or a team that has earned the right to qualification before you in the Colas selection process. So, as Garrett was mentioning, those results of regular season races play a big part, and also the order of which you finish in your region plays a big part, because you can only be considered after at least you're one team removed from the last qualifier in your region. So very important to have a very good regional result, as well as those Colas points when we're looking at these projections. So to set that up, why don't you run through, Garrett, on the men's side, your projections for the regionals for maybe like the top 3 or 4 spots, give or take 1 or 2, depending on the region.
Right. So, all right. So here's what I have right now in the Great Lakes region. Is for the men's side is Wisconsin 1, Notre Dame 2. Those are your automatic qualifiers, followed by Michigan, Butler, Michigan State, Purdue, Akron, Toledo. The Mid Atlantic, you have Villanova and Princeton as your auto qualifiers, followed by Georgetown, Navy. Midwest, you have your auto qualifiers of Oklahoma State and Iowa State, followed by Loyola, Tulsa, and Drake. In the mountain region, you have Northern Arizona men and BYU men as the auto qualifiers. I then have in order Colorado, New Mexico, Air Force, Montana State, Wyoming, Utah State as the next few teams there. Northeast region, I have Syracuse and Harvard as the auto qualifiers. I have Iona in third place there. South region, I have Alabama and Tennessee as the auto qualifiers. I have Florida State, Middle Tennessee, Auburn, and Ole Miss as the next 4 teams in that order. South Central, I have Arkansas and Texas as the 2 automatic qualifiers. Tulane, Texas A&M are the third and fourth place teams respectively. Southeast region, I have North Carolina auto qualifier, Virginia auto qualifier, followed by Furman, Wake Forest, Eastern Kentucky, Charlotte, Duke, NC State in that order in the Southeast region. And then to cap it all off, I have CBU, Washington as the auto qualifiers. Oh, excuse me. No, I take that back. I apologize. I do not have Washington as the auto qualifier. I have Stanford, excuse me, as the auto qualifier. So CBU, Stanford, Washington, Oregon, Boise State, Gonzaga, Portland, Portland, Cal Poly as the next few teams there. So those are my men's teams. Where do you want to start with that?
So why don't we go and look at the South region? So you have Alabama, Tennessee taking those first 2 spots.
I do.
And in a lot of our, I think, run throughs, we see Florida State qualifying eh, through the wild card process. Do you see any scenario where more than 3 teams make it? Do we see a scenario where maybe Florida State takes one of those auto qualifying spots? What do you kind of see in that South regional?
Yeah, I mean, could Florida State take one of the autos? Sure, I think they definitely could. But I don't really see an instance where there's a 4th team that gets in there. You would have to then expect that Alabama, Tennessee, or Florida State fall to that 4th place position, and then a team like Middle Tennessee State or Auburn hops into that 3rd place spot and effectively gets pushed in. So I
Yeah.
don't really see that happening. And even if you were to change, let's say, Tennessee and Florida State with those 2 swaps, if you take a look there, I don't really think it changes anything. Oh, I take that back. Tennessee doesn't get in this scenario.
Is that possible? They really don't have that many points?
Well, because let's think about it. So if they were facing, and we can take a quick look here as I run down this. Oh, were there no SEC teams? Okay, but yeah, I think because you would think about like who they faced at pre-nationals, right?
Yeah.
Which was a limited field, and they didn't really face any teams significantly up until then. They were second at pre-nationals, so they beat Virginia, but they beat Montana State, Purdue, Wyoming, Santa Clara, who we don't see getting in. And then if you go to the SEC championships, they lose to Arkansas, Alabama, and they only beat Texas A&M and Auburn. So they really only have 1 point, and that's
Wow.
probably where you see them just not getting in. Yeah.
Wow, so they're definitely in a much more precarious situation. That's interesting than I think either of us realized. So
Hmm.
I think Tennessee comes in as a heavy favorite to get that second spot, but that is interesting that Florida State's fine with third, whereas Tennessee really is not. So that'll be an interesting race to keep an eye on. I think we should go to the West. I think that's really the only other one where I think there's a little bit of a tight competition for that like second auto qualifying spot. CBU, I think we both agree, is the favorite to take the top spot. Stanford has been up and down, and they're coming off a high with their Pac-12 championship, and we have them in that second auto qualifying spot. But you look at the list of teams behind them, like Washington, Oregon, Gonzaga, Boise State, Portland, Cal Poly. Those teams could really, I don't, not betting on any of those teams to beat Stanford, but you could absolutely see that order being rearranged. And like we've talked about in weeks past, there's not a whole lot of Quals points for some of these teams like Oregon. So they really need to have a high finish, or they need someone to finish behind them that has a lot of Quals points to push them in.
Yeah, actually, it's funny if you take Stanford out of the second spot and just say they finished third, right, and you push Washington to second in this. Well, then Florida State. Remember how we said they were safe? Well, they're out, right? Because now it gets really interesting. It's that one thing. Just here's what happens here is that CBU and Stanford have all the points, right? They have all the points. So as soon as if they fall out of one of the top two spots, then as long as they're in the third or fourth place position, they're going to be moved in pretty easily. And that actually accelerates the process for a team like Boise State or Gonzaga to also get in. So in this scenario, everything that I've just said, it's all the same, except this time now we're saying CBU and Washington go 1-2 in the region. Well, now Stanford gets in, Oregon gets in, Boise State gets in, Gonzaga gets in, and Florida State sits out, Michigan State sits out. It's quite the scenario.
And just to maybe back up, in the previous scenario where Stanford finishes second, we're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, we're saying Oregon, Gonzaga, Boise State all not qualify.
Correct. Right. Because CBU and Stanford hold all those points. So their ability to push in other teams, their ability to quickly accelerate the selection process for their region doesn't really matter if they're automatically going. Instead, you're left with Washington with already so few points already trying to get selected. They eventually do. But after that, Oregon doesn't get in. Boise State and Gonzaga do not get in. And so I've been saying this since weeks ago. Like, hey, the West region is not like they're in trouble. Someone's going to be left home, I think. Left at home, and it's not going to be pretty.
And Boise State does have a decent amount of points, but it really is that them finishing behind, like if the order goes CBU, Stanford, Washington, like you said, Washington does not get selected for a while, and because they don't have a ton of points, which delays the process for like if so. Let's say Washington did have a lot of points, there's a much better chance that Boise State, Gonzaga get in, but because they don't, they just have to wait it out. And if they end up behind Oregon, they need to be able to push Oregon and themselves in, which isn't a scenario that they always have at their disposal. So the order, I mean, you could tweak the order by one or two spots. Even if we said, I think CBU, Stanford, Washington, Oregon, Boise State, I think Boise State and Oregon get in that scenario. Am I correct in saying that?
Can you repeat that again?
If it goes CBU, Stanford, Washington, Oregon, and then Boise State is that fifth team, do all five get in that scenario? I think they do.
Oh, why did that not correct? If CBU, Washington, Stanford, Oregon.
No, CBU, Stanford, Washington.
Oh, CBU, Stanford, Washington.
Oregon.
Yeah, well, that's yes. Yeah, well, that is what we've been saying.
Oh, you have Boise State at fifth? I thought you had Gonzaga at fifth. Oh, okay, so they don't even get in with Boise State at fifth?
No, they don't.
Okay, interesting. So, yeah, I mean, it is, gosh, that's just going to become a huge race. And really, Stanford doesn't really care all that much if they finish second or third, but all these other West teams are going to be rooting real
Stanford doesn't
hard
care
for
if they
them too.
finish fourth.
Yeah,
Like
really.
Stanford can finish fourth. They're like, yeah, we'll push you in. We don't care. Like Stanford does not care about this race, which is crazy considering that they've had a poor season.
Yeah.
Except the difference is that just like everyone else has had a much poorer season by comparison. Or if you're Oregon, you just haven't ran. Haven't
Yeah.
run. And so, um, yeah, I thought that was interesting. But there's 1,000 different like variations here that, like in conjunction with the South region, make things very, very interesting.
Well, so we talked about the South and the West region, but if we look at the Southeast, I think that's the region, right, where you're seeing teams that, or I mean, and we can talk about this later, the Great Lakes with Michigan State. But in the Southeast, they're really dependent on the West kind of settling as we think it will, and only 3 teams qualifying so that they can get as many teams through. We are projecting North Carolina and Virginia to get those 2 auto spots, but you look and then you have this great big group of Furman, EKU, Wake Forest, Duke, Charlotte, NC State. Like if they can all finish, any of them finish in the top 5, really, they're looking at scenarios where you're putting 5, maybe 6 teams in.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. Like that Southeast region just is like really tricky because like NC State has not had a good season, but could they beat Eastern Kentucky? I don't think it's unrealistic,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you kind of like look at the full output of like how they get in. It's I believe I want to say it's probably a push scenario if I had to guess. Yeah, it's Eastern Kentucky pushing them in if NC State finishes 5th and Eastern Kentucky finishes 6th. Which if you're Eastern Kentucky, you probably have to be like, oh, nice. There's a scenario where we finish 6th and we're in.
Yeah.
Awesome. Like that's great news. So,
And that's great news for a Wake Forest team too. That is probably going to be
mhm.
running without Rocky Hansen. I think we both still think they should finish in the top 5, but that gives them a little bit more room for error because they could get pushed in as long as they beat one of these heavy hitting Colas point teams. Then they're in good shape. And even if they don't, if they finish 5th or higher in a lot of our scenarios, they still qualify. But again, they're very much dependent on what happens out west for that to happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's dependent on what happens out west, and it's also dependent, I think, on um, like how far back Eastern Kentucky finishes. I think that's like a
Yeah.
key matter because if they finish back to 7th, then that gets tricky, and then it's like, well, where does Wake Forest finish, and when in that point does the selection process, select them? So I feel like Wake Forest should actually feel pretty good. I'm not saying they should feel amazing, but like if I'm Wake Forest, I'm like, man, wait, can I finish all the way back in like 6th place? And from running the calculations now,
6th place, I think that would be tough.
they get in.
Really?
If it goes UNC, Virginia, Furman, EKU, Charlotte, Wake Forest, yeah, Wake Forest gets the bid. And then
Wow.
what I think happens actually is that I want to say they probably push. If I had, yeah, they push Charlotte in.
So who's out in that scenario?
Good question. It would be
Is that Michigan State?
Michigan State is out,
Okay.
and Oregon, Boise State, Gonzaga, Portland, Cal Poly are out. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So that the Michigan State's the one that would change. So why don't we go there to the Great Lakes? So we have Wisconsin and Notre Dame taking those 2 auto spots, followed by Butler, Michigan, Michigan State. Is that the order you had,
Yeah.
or did you have Butler in one of those auto qualifying spots?
No, 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 no. I think you're
Okay.
right. I think I
Okay.
had it.
So Butler is in a pretty good spot. They should qualify. I think they should feel fairly safe. I think Michigan is in a solid spot as well. It's Michigan State, as we're kind of mentioning, where they absolutely can't finish any worse than 5th, and they need things to go as we kind of expect them to. They're in a lot of scenarios, but there are certain scenarios that are certainly possible where they do drop out. Finishing 4th, though, would give them almost, I don't want to say this with 100% certainty, but I feel like that would almost lock them in to a qualifying spot.
Yeah, I feel like Michigan State, if you finish fifth, you basically coin flip and it's
Yeah,
that's it. Like you have a coin flip chance of what happens there. If you get fourth though, if you're Michigan State and you get fourth with their lineup structure, I think is actually fairly reasonable.
could happen.
It could happen. So like Michigan falls to fifth and Michigan State gets fourth, they get in. And let me see if that's a push scenario. And it's a push scenario, yeah. So then let's say,
Yeah, mess up the West a little bit. See what happens there.
well, that depends. So who do you want me to have in fifth place in the Great Lakes? Do you want it to be Michigan?
Yeah, I think Michigan's the team that they're more likely to beat.
Okay. And so then let's say like Washington gets in over Stanford for the second auto. So CBU, Washington, Stanford, Oregon, Boise State, Gonzaga, Portland, Cal Poly. And then again with Michigan in fifth, Michigan State in fourth. On those projected qualifiers, you get Michigan State are in no problem. And then actually what's fascinating here, what happens, and wow, Florida State
This
drops out
okay.
and Wake Forest, Eastern Kentucky are good, but then Charlotte, Duke, NC State are out. And Stanford gets in, but so does Oregon and so does Boise State.
That seems like we have too many teams then.
You think so, right? But yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
So we're saying 5 in the
6,
Great
7,
Lakes,
8, 9,
5 in the Southeast, and 5 in the West.
15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31. Did I misdo my math there? I think I misdid my math. All right. I'll get back to you. I'll get back to you on that one. But yeah, no, I think that's what it comes out to be.
Interesting.
Oh, yeah,
So
no,
really,
31 teams. Yeah, it lists
yeah.
31 teams. Yeah.
Okay. So Michigan State, as we're kind of going through this, fourth place almost locks them into a spot. Fifth place, they like you said, I think that's a better way of saying it, a coin flip. If we look at some of these other regionals, like there's some like the Midwest where you're really only going to see two teams go through, more than likely Oklahoma State and Iowa State. But then you look at a lot of these other regions, like a Mid Atlantic, where Georgetown coming in third looks like they have a solid shot at qualifying, as does Iona, who we have in that third spot in the Northeast. But did like in that last scenario, did either of those teams drop off with 5 teams qualifying in all those regions that we just mentioned?
In the last scenario that I mentioned, you're right. Georgetown's the other team that falls off.
Okay.
So that is something to note. Yeah, Georgetown is another one of those teams that's kind of like Michigan State. It's like you probably get like a favorable scenario, but the favorable scenario is only like 55% chance of happening.
Right.
I think that's probably what they're banking on. So
Iona's in a little bit more of a secure spot, if I'm remembering.
which is weird. You wouldn't think that, but they are. Like they just, and I think it's that Nuttycombe performance, and I think a lot of it is that the assumption of Wisconsin running an A team at Nuttycombe.
So they would be maybe one of the teams that would struggle if Wisconsin ends up running a B team or ends up having run a B team at Nuttycombe.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could certainly make the argument because they are in this scenario the last team selected, and if they don't get that point, then yeah, then Florida State and Gonzaga go through the tiebreaker for that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Man, this is why we love the Colas points. Like all these,
Well,
like
actually,
it's
Iona and Florida State and Gonzaga. It's a three-way tiebreaker in that scenario for Iona to get the last spot.
really,
It's a
man.
head-to-head scenario. Yeah.
Wow. You see, this is why it's so exciting. Like you have the smallest differences in these teams, and it's the difference between you being able to go run at NCAA's and you sitting at home. Like
Literally. Go ahead.
It's situations that are completely out of your control. It's a butterfly wing like flapping in the West Regional that changes something in the Northeast. Like it's incredible.
Do you know that meme of the guy who like hits the small domino and then
Yeah,
it
yeah,
builds up and like it knocks it down and it's just it's like it's just the funniest
it's
funniest
like
things where it's like
Oregon's schedule is that first small domino.
yeah, it's like drafting Michael Carter Williams and then
Yeah.
Ben Simmons leaves the Sixers
Yeah.
for like eternity. Yeah, it's like that. The difference here is that like it could be like Wisconsin like opting to decide to run one guy over the other means like five different teams could get in versus not getting in. Like it's a significant caveat.
Yeah, gosh, that's wild. So yeah, I think we haven't really talked about the mountain. I think we feel pretty strong about the 5 teams qualifying there: NAU, BYU, Colorado, New Mexico, Air Force. All 5 of those teams have solid point totals. Don't really see any other team making it out of that in any of our scenarios, unless perhaps one of those 5 teams finishes sixth, and then there could be a push scenario which would cannibalize a spot for one of these other regions. But it seems like that region is pretty set with their 5. South Central, you're just going to get Arkansas, Texas. Would be surprised to see anything different there. And I think that's all the regions. Is there anything else that we missed? Any scenarios with any of these regions on the men's side?
CBU Stanford go 1-2, followed by Oregon, Boise State, Washington. Oregon, Boise State get in, Washington is left out. That's the only other thing I can think of
Interesting. Okay.
in the standard initial
Because
projection that I have.
Boise doesn't have like a small, like they have a decent amount of
They
points.
do. It depends on like where you select them at, but yeah, like they are at one point they're not like fighting for like a tiebreaker scenario to win the selection point. They have like a clear. I remember like in my scenario that I have on the site that's again different than what's a couple things that we're having here.
Yeah.
They get up to like 7 points at some scenarios.
Yeah,
Well,
and that's the
that's
thing.
like driving
Like,
it on, but
right. I mean, it's just really how soon they can get selected, and that all comes down to how high they finish at regions. Like, if they finish fourth, they should make it. But finishing fifth or sixth leaves them in a very precarious situation.
yeah, yeah, and so I'm sure. Man, isn't it's so crazy? Like just one thing and everything changes, which is like that's why I love it. I think it's fascinating, but it's also crazy to think like, and we'll talk about this more on the women's side, where just
Hmm.
like there's some of these teams where you're like, man, they wouldn't make it, really? Like they're really not one of the 31 best teams. It's not like it's not like we're leaving out like NAU, right?
Right.
But this is what it is. So that's it. That's all I have.
All right. Well, why don't we go to the women's side, and I'll give you a second to pull up those projections. But why don't you run us through your projections for each region on the women's side?
Yes, I just want to double check and make sure that I have everything. Are these? Oh, that's why this is the men's. I got very confused there for a moment. I was like, I didn't realize they were ranked that highly. Yes, so for the Great Lakes, we're going Notre Dame, Michigan State as the autos, Wisconsin 3, Michigan 4. Mid Atlantic, we're going Georgetown and Penn State 1-2, Princeton 3, Villanova 4. Midwest region, we have Oklahoma State, Iowa State going 1-2 as the autos, and then Northwestern and Nebraska going 3-4. The Mountain region, we have NAU, BYU going 1-2 as the autos, followed by Colorado, Utah Valley, Utah, Colorado State, Montana State, New Mexico, Air Force, Utah State, and Wyoming, all in that order. Northeast region, we have Harvard and Providence as the 1-2 autos, followed by Syracuse and Boston College and Connecticut in the 3-4-5 positions. South region, oh, excuse me, I didn't update this last time. There we go. We had, as I alter this, and this really is the region we're going to have to talk about. It's
Yes.
Florida 1, Lipscomb 2 is my personal autos, Tennessee 3, Alabama 4, Ole Miss 5. South Central, we have Arkansas 1, Tulane 2, Texas A&M 3, Texas 4, SMU 5. Southeast region, we have NC State 1, Virginia 2 as the autos, and then Furman is 3, North Carolina 4, Duke 5, Wake Forest 6, Elon 7. And in the West region, we have Stanford 1, Washington 2, California Baptist 3, Oregon 4, Oregon State 5, Boise State 6, Portland in 7th, and Cal Poly 8th.
All right. So I think like you mentioned, the most pressing region is the South, and
It is.
that the order that we have, because for me, I have Florida, Alabama as those first two spots, and then Lipscomb, Tennessee, Ole Miss. In my scenario, all five of those teams qualify. In your scenario, you only see what, three go through?
Only the first two, only the autos.
Only first two. So yeah, this is where it really comes down to. And the key to all of this, and we were talking about this a lot before we started the podcast, is Alabama. Where does Alabama finish?
And
Because
kind of Tennessee too.
and kind of Tennessee, yeah. But Alabama doesn't have really hardly any points. And they really need to either finish second or finish ahead of Lipscomb or Ole Miss, really. Or would Ole Miss push them
Well,
in?
they would need. So here's what needs to happen. They need to finish in the top. They need to finish in the top two, or then in no less, they need to finish in the top four, preferably third place,
Third,
hoping that
yeah.
Lipscomb and Ole Miss pushes them in, or they finish fourth. Ole Miss or Lipscomb is the third place team, and then one of the other two is behind them, then eventually pushing them in later.
Yeah.
That didn't make sense to anyone who's listening, but that's how crazy this is. Like Alabama is not only just praying that they finish high enough, they're praying that everyone else falls back in a weird enough order. And basically they're praying like, hey, just Tennessee, can you like have a miracle day and get in the second auto?
Yeah, basically, if Alabama doesn't get that second spot, they want Tennessee to get that second spot because Tennessee is the only other team that really doesn't have many points. So they would rather them get in, and then Lipscomb and Ole Miss can get selected quickly. One of those teams can get selected quickly if they finish third, and then that fifth place team, if it's Ole Miss or Lipscomb that finish behind Alabama, then they can push in Alabama quickly. So I mean, I am higher on Alabama. I think they have great upfront firepower. I think their depth. You've been championing their depth a lot this year, and they have had a good showing. They didn't run great at SECs. What is there a reason for your kind of is it more confidence in these other teams? Is it a little more skepticism about Alabama? Why do you have them all the way back and forth?
Well, I just think like you just kind of look at the SEC results and it's like, well,
Mhm.
Florida's won. Lipscomb has really given us zero reason to doubt them. Lipscomb has actually been very, very good. And
Yes.
I think that their lineup's way more complete. I think, frankly, safer. So maybe they might not get second, but I think I like them in third at the least,
Yes.
ahead of
Yeah.
Alabama. And then Tennessee, I think they're just, I think the Tennessee part is like where you could start getting debating here, where,
Yeah.
like they beat them in SECs, and I think that probably sticks in my head. And, Tennessee's on a little bit more of a hot streak. Um, but I don't think it's like crazy unrealistic to have Alabama fourth. I think that in a regional race where it's going to be like really top heavy, but still kind of deep, I wonder how like that back end is
Yeah.
going to hold up because it wasn't amazing at SECs. And again, like it's in my scenario, they beat Ole Miss, but Ole Miss, like the third place team ahead of them is Tennessee, and Tennessee can't get in without a push, and
Right.
Alabama can't get in. So if Alabama can't get pushed in, then Tennessee's not going to get pushed in.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, yeah, and I do think that the region being as competitive really as it's ever been, I think will be a advantage for Alabama because I think the point totals are going to be a little bit higher. So like them having a really good 1-2 punch, I think will be a lot more beneficial. Obviously, they won't be able to compete with Florida if Florida's running well, but I think that'll give them a big advantage over those other three teams in that scenario. So in my scenario, I have five teams going through from the South. You have just two. Who is the beneficiary of just two teams qualifying from the South region? Is there another region that really reaps the benefits of those now open spots?
well, let's quickly input. Let's do a side by side comparison. So you have Florida one, Alabama two. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then followed by who are the three, four, five?
Lipscomb, Tennessee, Ole Miss.
Okay. So in that scenario, yes, you're right. They get in there. Um, the teams who would, in your scenario, who would then fall out of mine, um, are North Carolina and Duke would both fall out in this scenario. In my scenario,
Yes, in my scenario, those teams would not
I'm sorry,
be.
and those two teams, yeah, in your scenario, those two teams fall out. Um, and then I'm trying to figure out where the third team is that ultimately gets in. I want to say,
Is
oh, it's
it
Boston College.
Boston College? Yeah, that's what I was
It's
gonna say.
Boston College. That's the determinant. And Boston College was already very much on the fringe there as well. Yeah, isn't that crazy? Like we're talking about
Yeah.
Boston College making the meet.
Yeah, yeah, that what a turnaround for that program. And yeah, so why don't we go look at some of these other regions that on the women's side, there's really some open races for those first two automatic qualifying spots, and in regions where only two teams are going to make it. And I think the first one that comes to mind is the South Central region. Arkansas is in our mind a lock to make it, but after that, it gets really interesting because Texas just hasn't been very good this year, and they normally dominate that other spot. We have Tulane finishing in that second spot, but then I mean, I think it's going to be a very competitive race with them, Texas A&M, and if Texas can pull things together, maybe even them. What are you looking for in that race? And I mean, it doesn't really change the Colas scenarios because only two teams are going to make it regardless out of the South Central. But what do you feel good about Tulane, and what do you kind of see going into that race?
Well, so the nice thing about covering all aspects of this site is that I've covered D2,
Hmm.
and Gemma Robello, who came over from I want to say Pittsburgh State as the transfer, has been phenomenal. She won the AAC title at her conference meet this 2 weeks ago, week and a half ago, and her having that low stick firepower up there when paired with Julianne Lily Bell and Dana Diaz, right? Those were they had three in the top five, and the only thing that I would watch with Tulane is how far back is their fifth, because in the scoring at AACs and not ACC but AAC, they went 1 4 5 10 22 54. So it's basically like they should have the best lineup,
Yep.
but if one thing goes wrong, then Texas A&M, Texas, SMU could potentially get involved.
Yeah, it's fun. I think this is the most wide open we've seen the South Central. I mean, really on the men or women's side for a long
But
time.
honestly, not for a good reason.
Yeah, no, it's not because teams have stepped up, unfortunately, but it's still,
Tulane has actually been better.
yeah,
Tulane's
yeah.
been good. Yeah,
I'm excited to open up the South Central results for the first time in a while. Like normally, I just don't even need to.
yeah. They need
So
to realign that region. They just do.
yeah, especially with the South getting better and the Southeast is always very good. Like
Yeah.
divvy that up a little bit more. I was always big advocate of that for selfish reasons while I was in school. Um, but the other region I think on the women's side that is a little wide open is the Mid Atlantic. Again, you have one team that I think is a lock, Georgetown. We have Penn State in that second spot, but you have traditional powerhouse Villanova. We have not making it, and then you have Princeton as well. Kind of same question here. I mean, what gives you confidence about Penn State going up against these other teams?
They have the least to dislike. Is basically it. And it's like if they were.
Again,
I
it's
don't
just
really
a
think
weak year, like
it's
for
a
this
weak
region.
year, and like it's already a weak region. And like they were when they went to Nuttycombe, and double check here, yeah, they were 27th at Nuttycombe, where they beat Boise State, Elon, Florida State, Air Force, Utah State, Texas, which is like, eh.
You beat a
It's like,
bunch of teams who are not going to make nationals.
no. And then they went to Big Tens, and it's like, well, they beat Michigan State won, followed by Wisconsin, Michigan, and Penn State. But Michigan hasn't even been that good.
Yeah,
But you take a look at Villanova. Villanova has simply struggled. They pre
yeah,
nationals results weren't pretty. Princeton, I think Princeton, you could very realistically make the argument
absolutely.
for. But I also look at Princeton. I'm like, I don't really know what do they. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean there's a reason why we haven't really talked about any three of these teams all year. They just haven't been really in the NCAA picture, and all of a sudden we're going to be seeing at least we're going to be seeing one of them line up in a few weeks at nationals.
I mean, they got second at Ivies and scored 73 points,
And beating
comfortable.
Columbia is solid.
And Dartmouth, yeah, I mean that was good. Penn too. Like they did well there, and so maybe it's something for us to go back and be like, maybe Princeton should take that spot, but there's still just not a lot there.
Yeah.
There's just not.
So I'm wondering if we put Princeton in at that second spot
Hmm.
instead of Penn State. Penn
Oh, because
State
then
gave
you're talking about the
give
points, right?
yeah, Penn State would have given a lot of points out because of Nuttycombe. Does that change anything?
Let's double check just to make sure everything else that I had here was as initially put in, and it does look like that was the case. Yes, 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 yes. Okay, and then you have Mid Atlantic region. We're putting Princeton in for
Princeton.
Penn State, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and let's see what happens here. All right. Great Lakes seems right. Mid Atlantic seems right. Midwest seems right. Mountain seems the same thing. And now it gets interesting. South gets no one else other than Florida and Lipscomb. South Central gets Arkansas, Tulane, and Texas A&M,
What?
which I think. Let me double check something. I think that actually might be. I don't know if that's correct because Boston College gives them the point in those results that we were talking about earlier that I prefaced with this. And so I think that in that scenario, Texas A&M should not be getting in. So I would not sure if I want to validate these sets
That
of
would be
results yet.
hilarious if we just talked about the South Central the way we did and they got 3 teams in.
Yeah, well, I mean, it'd still be true, but yeah, Texas A&M would have 2 points, and then that wouldn't happen. They would really only have one, and that's
Okay.
all they're supposed to have. Um, so I don't think
So
that's
you would have
true.
North Carolina and Duke make it, right? And then the 5 teams in the West still?
I want to double check. Is that because then you might actually get a scenario where, in that case, Connecticut gets in.
Wow. You get 5 teams out of the Northeast.
I think you would get one Southeast team. I think you would get North Carolina maybe, unless Duke pushes them in, and then Connecticut can't get in. But yeah, it's a weird thing where that race gets that
Interesting.
one B race from Boston College where you have them in the Beantown results. They should be a B team. They're not listed there, so I think that's why Texas A&M is shown. I don't think that's correct. I don't think if you take out that point, Texas A&M is tied with like a billion
Yeah.
other
Yeah,
teams.
yeah, yeah. Right, right.
They're not there. So
Wow. What an interesting we hadn't even thought of that, for the difference that Penn State gives in terms of
no,
points compared to Princeton. So that I mean,
I
that's
think we
gonna
are
be
safe to say that it does make some level of impact potentially.
yes. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, that'll be one to keep an eye on. The Midwest, not really much to see there. Oklahoma State, Iowa State, I think should easily qualify. If we want to bump up to the Great Lakes, we have Notre Dame, Michigan State, and Wisconsin all feeling pretty comfortable in those first 3 spots. Don't really see, I mean, Michigan and Ohio State just haven't been as good this year. There does Wisconsin get in even at finishing fourth? That I would imagine they have enough points where they would still be fine in that scenario.
Yeah, let me check here. Yeah, they would push in Michigan, and then the teams that would fall out are Boston College in this scenario. No South
Okay.
team still gets in. Southeast goes down to Furman, North Carolina, and Duke, and then it's West, same thing, CBU, Oregon, Oregon State. So
Okay. All right. So really, yeah, really not a whole lot in the Great Lakes either. We look at the mountain region. In almost every scenario, we think we're going to see 6 teams go through: NAU, BYU, Colorado, Utah Valley, Utah, and Colorado State. All of those teams have a good amount of points. I mean, there's really, I guess we could see an upset with like an Air Force and Montana State getting a 6th spot, and then them like maybe Colorado State not qualifying.
So what
But
happens? I have Montana State. I just decided I was like I already know where this is going.
right,
If Montana State leapfrogs Colorado State, then Colorado State I think pushes them in, and then the team that doesn't advance is
Boston
there's no
College.
South region teams, and who's the team that I'm missing? I think it just leans
South.
on the fact. Oh, there's no Boston College.
Yeah, okay, that's what I. So Boston College is teetering.
Yeah, hanging on
And
the edge.
so why don't we go to the Northeast then? Sarah, we have Harvard. You have Harvard and Providence in those first two automatic qualifying spots. Syracuse has plenty of points in that third spot.
By the
Boston,
way, I have Harvard and Providence.
yes, yeah, you have Harvard and Providence and Syracuse
Yeah,
in the third spot, right? Okay,
yeah, yep,
sorry.
yeah.
And then Boston College in the fourth spot and UConn in the fifth. So
Hmm.
like we mentioned, there might be a scenario where UConn squeaks in, but really Boston College is really already very much on the line in a 50-50 scenario.
And I
If
just want
we're
to
to,
actually interrupt you, and I
yeah, go
apologize.
ahead.
I think Connecticut was actually also the benefactor of that
Oh, okay.
flawed Boston. So I'm now realizing Connecticut. I'm really sorry, but you would need a really big day. You need to be a Boston College at least. So
Yes.
sorry to cut you off.
Okay. Yeah, fair point. So Boston, I mean Syracuse, really any of Syracuse, Harvard, Providence, if they were to finish third or fourth, they're fine, right? I mean, they have enough points in terms of being able to push in.
Yeah. Let me double check. Yeah. Yeah. The Harvard again being an at-large team. Well, I guess. No, I guess I don't know. Oh no. I take that back. No, take it. Yeah, yeah. Harvard being an at-large team maybe kind of matters. I'd prefer that they're an auto team for our scenario, but otherwise, yeah,
Right.
it doesn't really matter. So
Okay. All right. So really the key there in the Northeast to be keeping an eye on Boston College, they have to finish fourth and then they have to have everything kind of go their way in order to qualify. That top three we would expect to finish in any of those order. If Boston College can finish third, then they're sitting pretty. I think they should qualify,
mhm.
but they have to finish at least fourth to keep those hopes alive. And well, let's see. We haven't talked about the Southeast regional where you have NC State and Virginia taking those top two auto spots, and then the at-large spot. We see Furman getting that, and then North Carolina and Duke are really right on the edge there as well in terms of different scenarios playing out. They're going to be kind of praying that the South goes the way that Garrett projects, where there's only two teams there. Otherwise, they're going to be facing an uphill battle to make nationals.
The Southeast region, yeah. I mean, you're really looking at UNC and Duke, and it's amazing how after the season that UNC has had, where they're falling back in these fields, that like they're still actually like in contention.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's actually crazy that like the UNC women and Stanford men are not too different. The
No,
only difference is that Stanford men was great at their
pulled it
conference meetings,
together at conference. Yeah,
but the also the side to that is UNC could be like, yeah, but our conference is just way better this year,
yeah,
like way better
definitely.
comparatively, women versus men, but still. And so if UNC was in like the West region, I'd feel actually a little more confident, despite it featuring like Oregon and Oregon State and CBU and Stanford and Washington. And like, I think there's actually scenarios like where they mix it up and they can
Yeah.
beat an Oregon or an Oregon State or a team like that. So, yeah, it's just crazy how that works out. But them and Duke, I think them and Duke are going to be, I think, again, it's one of those scenarios where 55% of the time it favors them, but there's going to be 45% scenarios that could happen where it's not too pretty.
Furman would push either of them in most scenarios if they were to finish third and Furman fourth.
Right. I mean, they obviously can't push both teams in if they're
Right. Yeah, they
facing
would
it.
just
Right.
yeah.
Right. But
So
yes, they could push one of them.
North Carolina or Duke finishing third almost certainly would put them in, but fourth or even fifth could do it. It's just like you're saying, you really need to have things go your way. Um, Out west, we have five teams, and really, I think this is we would expect these five teams. What order they finish in, I'm not 100% sure, but the teams of Stanford, Washington, CBU, Oregon State. Does it really matter all that much the order? I mean, all these teams have a solid amount of points. They're
Um,
all
I
gonna qualify.
I think it might matter for Oregon. I think
Okay.
it slightly matters for Oregon. If Oregon falls to fifth in this current scenario, they're fine. but there are, it's like that South region could negatively affect them. Because remember, everyone,
Okay.
like
Right.
in my scenarios that I'm talking about, two teams only come out of the South,
And
right?
up to
So
5 could, like, very
up to
realistically.
five could absolutely come out of there. So like Oregon might like want to be like on, hey, you got to run well here, and Oregon State, Washington, Stanford, and CBU could all very realistically beat Oregon.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, they really just need to beat one of those 4 teams,
Mhm.
to feel really good because Oregon State's got plenty of points, and but yeah, that's a really good point. They need, like their men counterparts, need to make sure that they have kind of a push in possibility if they need it.
Yeah, yeah, it's crazy how, I mean, I will, I said this, was talking to you this beforehand, like the women's South region determines basically what happens everywhere else.
Yeah.
And this is it, the West region with Oregon, Oregon State, and the Southeast with UNC and Duke. Those regions, how they, what the outcomes of who qualifies out of that almost entirely depends on the South.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And how many times have we ever said that about the South region?
Crazy. I know.
Absolutely wild. So I think that's all the regions on the women's side. Did we miss any big takeaways there?
No, I think it's pretty straightforward. Again, we are going to try to get some of these things updated. We're going to have our official cost projections with all the technicalities written out. I'll explain everything step by step, qualifier by qualifier on the site for our subscribers. You can go check them out there. And then, again, we'll also try to be getting some of these like quick fixes here to Bo before the actual national meet or regional meet, excuse me, happens, before we put out our projections. So we're working on fixing those tweaks for Badger Classic and whatnot. But otherwise, that's all I got. Ben, this is great. I had
Yeah,
fun.
yeah. This is always fun to see. I mean, we do our prep. We like talk about this beforehand, and yet almost every year we do this during the podcast. We find something new that we hadn't come
Yeah.
up with before, which is, I mean, I think it's always a cool experience for everyone involved. To you guys are listening to things as we're figuring them out together, and you guys could probably, if you want to mess around with xcquals.com, probably find some scenarios that we didn't even talk about. There's a lot going on there.
Yeah, it's super cool. So, shout out to Bo Waggoner. Really appreciate you. Thank you, Bo. And again, working to fix the few tweaks there that we were talking about earlier. But other than that, that is all I've got.
All right. Well, until next week when we have regionals to talk about and we'll know who qualified for nationals. I'll talk to you.
I'll talk to you.